Hello, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us today. We're excited to have this storytelling in design webinar with Shure and Isaac Carlson, the videographer. Shure and Design for America have been partnering together for a few years now in various ways through events, and we really appreciate the partnership. We're thrilled that this year Shure is actually sponsoring our very first storytelling competition. So all of the teams from across the network will have the chance to submit their final presentations from the year or the semester and help share the story of what's happening in their community. And with Shure, we'll have some judging from Shure, as well as some really fantastic prizes. We have some Shure Bluetooth headphones for the team that tells the best story, and then a special category for the best multimedia story that has a brand new Shure microphone that will help you capture stories again in the future that you can use for your team or your studio and your research. So thank you very much to Shure for all of the support there in our storytelling competition and for coming in today and helping us learn a little bit more about what goes into a good story. On screen with us today, we have Alden Burke, who is our Design for America program coordinator, helps tell Design for America's story really fantastically. We're thrilled to have her here. We have Alex Chen. Alex is a former DFA studio lead and fellow. Alex worked on telling DFA's story for a while, and Alex now works at Shure. Thank you for connecting us together, Alex. We have Chad. Chad is program manager at Shure, leads the design efforts there and UI UX side, and is a really fantastic partner, helped us get connected. We have Isaac, videographer, who's going to have some really fantastic examples of what goes into a good story, as well as techniques and tips for your teams to capture the story in real time and help craft the story, even if you don't know what the end results are going to look like. And then we have Ritvik, rising studio lead at Purdue, and we're looking forward to the conversation afterwards, as well as bringing in some of the conversations from you folks who are SVP before. With that, I'm going to give it away to Isaac, get started, and then we'll have a conversation.
Sounds great. All right. So very brief background. My name is Isaac Carlson. I'm currently the videographer, in-house videographer at Shure. My background comes from a little bit of television, a little bit of film work, some nonprofit documentary, and about a year ago joined the team here at Shure. But I've been doing video production, audiovisual storytelling for about 11 years now. So I'm just going to kind of dive right in and give a sense of the format that I'm going to kind of run things through here. I'm going to start by sharing an example, a video that we produced here at Shure, kind of telling the success story of one of some of our customers using one of our products to kind of overcome some of the challenges in the design of their concert tour. And then I'm going to try and give a secondary example that I'll kind of come up with sort of on the spot, where I'll be talking about, if a project isn't completed and you're kind of in the midst of things, kind of telling the story of working through a challenging project, as opposed to kind of exploring the impact after it's all done. So I'm just going to go ahead and start by playing the video, and then I've got like 5 pieces of advice that I'm going to kind of break down in terms of the example video, and I'm also going to break down in terms of kind of like a work in progress sort of an example. So let me go ahead and start sharing my screen here. And I apologize for the audio here, but we'll make it work and dive right into this this example video.
There was a lot of things that could have gone wrong. In this case, completely empty stage and a caravan mobile is a really simple idea, but technically not so easy to realize.
The journey began last summer to try and find some gear that could actually do 48 channels of wireless with a load of in-ears. And, oh, by the way, once you've got all these RF channels, we're going to hang 125 feet of chain around the stage. Unfortunately, my friends at Shure said, We've got something coming out next month that you should probably take a look at. Accent Digital is amazing. This tour wouldn't exist without it. I don't think it would be possible, A, because of getting the bandwidth that's necessary for that many channels of wireless, and B, because it just sounds so much better than the analog side. All the high frequency stuff, everything that I would have expected to hear, like little, oh, it's not quite the same, I don't hear it at all. It sounds as good as any wired system I've ever heard.
People were saying, this sounds too good for you guys to be actually playing this. You've got tracks, you got playback happening, right? And so now we do a thing where we start a song instrument by instrument and people hear how the whole thing fits together.
I know for a fact things have been dropped, things have hit the floor pretty hard, and we haven't, nothing's broken. I don't think that we've necessarily put it to the use for which it was entirely intended. Throwing microphones and transmitters on drums that are being beat on pretty severely for 2 hours.
Just the fact that they can move around and not worry about dropouts, interference. They pass through the chain. They even do a song encased in the chain. There's no issues. Anything that we throw at Accent Digital, it just seems to work.
I don't know what I'm going to do next, but it's hard to imagine going back to a kind of more conventional setup now, certainly for me, but I think for others who have seen this show, they're also thinking, whoa, he's moved the goalposts.
So there, just as an example of a video that was produced at Shure. Obviously, it's got a bit more of like a promotional bent. We're promoting our own product, but it also kind of tells the story of David Byrne's tour team who are setting up. We're faced with these challenges and are kind of using our tool to kind of overcome some of those challenges. And that's kind of the format that I want to use to break down the rest here. So let me pull up my presentation here. And we can dive into that. Sorry, one moment. Start sharing my screen again. There we go. So basically, I'm going to give kind of 5 pieces of generic advice. They are bent a little bit more towards audio-visual storytelling, but kind of apply to storytelling in general, just 5 pieces of wisdom, and then I'm going to break those down in terms of the video we just watched, and also in terms of a more on-the-spot in progress example. So the first bit of advice is tell the story from the outside moving in. That's both from a visual standpoint, speaking from audio-visual, and a narrative standpoint. You start with the broader strokes of the story, and then kind of hone in on the specifics. The idea being you're kind of funneling people in. You're starting with something that's relevant enough to everyone to kind of catch everyone's attention, and then you start focusing in on more of the like specific challenges or specific solutions. And this is done visually as well, so you can kind of see here I've laid out like the first few shots that I start a video with, kind of establish some of these initial questions that we're asking ourselves when we start watching something. Where are we? What's going on? Whose story am I watching? So the visually kind of like starting wide and funneling in helps viewers kind of get their bearings and then also focus in. So the fictional example I'm going to kind of work with here. Off the top of my head, thinking the other day, based kind of on a real example. Let's say that I'm telling the story of building a project that puts tutoring resources into laundromats. So in terms of like starting wide, focusing in, if I'm showing a video version of it, kind of I'm going to follow that same visual standard where I start like establishing what's the setting. We're in a laundromat, and I'm going to kind of come in closer and start telling the story of this program of a tutoring program set up inside of a laundromat. Second main piece of advice is establishing stakes. Every good story has stakes, meaning, what is the challenge? You've got heroes and they have to overcome a challenge. So setting those up early into the story immediately gets your viewer or your listener invested in the story that you're trying to tell. So, for example, in this video, the stakes are kind of coming from that quote. I forget what he's called. John Chadwick is his name. So he's talking about there's 40 channels of wireless. We've got a load of in-ear monitors for listening, and they're also going to hang 125 feet around the chain around the stage, which, if you're not familiar with audio, is an extremely challenging wireless environment because metal is interfering with wireless radio frequency signals, and also having that many channels all within a tight space. And then you've got other channels for in-ear monitoring. It's a very challenging scenario. So kind of setting up early into the video, what are the stakes here, is a good way to kind of draw focus into the story that you're telling. So again, looking at the example I'm thinking of with the tutoring program inside of laundromats, one way I might tackle the stakes is by kind of addressing where are the education gaps. So again, I'm kind of working off a fictional example, so I don't have necessarily real statistics to work with, but kind of telling the story of largely the laundromat is frequented by lower income customers who also maybe have an educational gap where they don't have access to the same tutoring resources that might be available to students who are in a higher income bracket. So the stakes that I'm setting up in telling my story is I'm looking at this problem, and I see that the stakes are that we have a whole group of people who are not being given equal access. And then you're kind of setting up why the stakes is why the viewer or the listener should be invested in the story that you're telling. So that's a way that I could kind of tackle that from this story standpoint. Third little bit of advice, and this is a big one, and I think that this is one that it's easy to kind of get lost from. The idea is to know your audience and to speak to your audience. So you want to talk about your project or the impact of your story in a way that's most relevant to the audience you're talking to, as opposed to what's most important to you, which is kind of hard to get away from. So it's very important to know from the get-go who you're trying to tell the story to, identify your key audience, and make sure that you're telling your story in a way that's relevant to them. So for instance, the video with David Byrne is definitely aimed at audio professionals, and it's a higher tier product. So it's aimed at like larger touring operations, bigger shows. So I need to think about, since that's my audience, what sorts of things are they going to care about? So some of the things that my audience cares about in that bracket, they care about sound quality, they care about durability, they care about reliability. There's a bunch of other stuff, obviously, that I could pull out, but kind of picking the things that I know my audience cares about in terms of the project, which in this case is the product, Axion Digital. And then I want to focus my storytelling around those points that are relevant to my audience. So in this example, maybe the audience that I'm trying to approach is potential investors or potential donors. So the story that I might want to tell is all about the like small human impact, which is super important. That's that sets the stakes, that gets people invested. We want to hear stories of individuals, but if I'm creating a video for donors, I want to not just talk about the need for this, but I also want to talk about how my idea could be potentially effective. So I want to focus in around things about like find little micro examples to point to that are success stories where tutoring has lifted people in their educational goals. I want to focus in on maybe some experts instead of just talking to the people who are being affected by it. Because to a donor, they're going to care about, like, does this thing have legs? Is this a viable option? So I'm going to probably want to look to interview some experts in the field of education to kind of get them involved in the story of this being a unique opportunity to kind of add to children's education in the setting of a laundromat. The fourth point, and this one is another one that I tend to see kind of go by the wayside a lot, is to make the subject of the story the hero, and also to let the story tell itself. And a way that this shows up is basically the main point behind this is, as much as possible, when I'm telling a story, I want to let the people who are inside of the story tell it for themselves, as opposed to me kind of as an outsider, a documentarian, telling my side of it. So a way that shows up a lot, especially in audiovisual, is if you can avoid using on-screen text for statistics, or using like voiceover of your own voice, kind of bringing up points that maybe if you add another interview or you ask an additional question, you might be able to get people who are already a part of the story to give you that same information. And it's a lot more effective when people who are inside of the story are telling the story than it is if you're on the outside kind of preaching about it, so to speak. So examples in here, well, actually kind of that's going to be better broken down in the next point. But speaking again kind of about this laundromat and tutoring example, if I'm telling the story of a tutoring program being set up in laundromats, I'm going to want, instead of including like statistics in text up front, maybe I go back to what I was saying, where I'm speaking to an expert, someone who's already a part of this evolution of the advantage of tutoring programs, who's done the research and who is, involved inside of the story. Maybe I'm letting them tell me and tell the audience some of the statistics and some of the pain points, as opposed to me adding that in a text form or as voiceover. Because like I said, it always comes across more effectively when people inside the story are the ones telling it. The fifth piece of advice, and this is going to be kind of the meatiest one to break into, is I like to build a format, make a format, and then break the format when I'm telling the story. And why this is effective is, once I've built a framework that I know is effective for getting me roughly where I need to be, it allows me to work a lot faster and know that I've kind of got a successful format set up. And then I can go, because no one likes to see something that feels like a format. So once I've built it, what I want to do is go in and find ways to like kind of break it up and make it feel a lot less like I've formatted this story. So the format that I like to use, and you can find your own that works well for you, but mine is based off of basically how I was taught to write English argumentative essays, where I start with a hook, I go into my thesis, the main idea. I've got some like smaller ideas that support the bigger idea, and specific concrete examples that support those subpoints. And then at the end, I like to kind of reference back to the way that I opened up the story, and then hint at opportunities for the future. So I'm going to kind of roughly go through each of these points, how they appear in the David Byrne video. So the hook is, there were a lot of things that could have gone wrong. He kind of explains how big this idea was and hints at how challenging it was to accomplish. The thesis, and I got really lucky here, and sometimes the thesis is just implied. But in this particular case, basically one of the interview subjects gives me my thesis straight up. This product is amazing, and this tour wouldn't be possible without it. That's the main idea. And then I go into subpoints, and I kind of pulled the subpoints, again, going back to the things that my audience cares about. Know my audience, speak to them. So each of my subpoints is just based on those things that my audience might care about. And then I need to back up those smaller ideas with concrete examples. And those are quotes from audio recording or the video recording that reinforce these larger ideas like reliability. So the idea that they're passing through the chain, they're encased in chain, and there's no issues. We're able to find this equipment that has 40 channels. These ideas are backing up reliability, sound quality. We've got the front of house mixer talking about how it sounds like a wired system. And that we've got David Byrne talking about how it sounded so good that people thought that they were using recorded tracks as opposed to playing live. Those two specific examples reinforce the idea of sound quality and durability. We've got these two quotes about things falling on the ground, things being put on drums and beaten, and that reinforces the idea that that the solution is durable. And then for the end of the video, the conclusion, I bring it back to David Byrne has this wild idea that's going to be hard to pull off. And now we're thinking about what might he do next. And he's saying, well, now that I've done something unconventional, it's hard for me to think about going back to something conventional. So that kind of has a nice flow to it to set up for the, like when you're initially putting the story together. But as you might have noticed, the order that I have these in this presentation is not the order that they appear in the video, because I don't want it to feel like it's a rigid, structured format. I want it to feel a little bit more organic. So what I did after I'd kind of set things up in this order is I went back through and I looked at my other pieces of advice here, my other subpoints, and I found ways to use this to kind of break up the order. So, for example, this "what are the stakes" example. There's the line that John Chadwick has about the number of this 40 channels of wireless load of in-ears. That sort of it reinforces the reliability idea, but instead of putting that there, I bring it in earlier, so it kind of sets up the stakes. So kind of using these other pieces of advice to look at your format and find ways to break it up and make it feel more natural is an effective approach to that. Another thing to do is to kind of just look at where there are organic transition points between ideas, where maybe someone is transitioning from talking about one subpoint into another, is another good way to kind of like break up the rigid feel of this thesis, subpoint, examples, conclusion, etc. So the last thing I'll kind of end with here before I go into questions. This page is just some additional resources. On the left, I've got a couple of storytelling examples, a book and a lecture series on the left there. On the right are some blogs and YouTube channels that I follow for more technical knowledge about video production, audio production, and the more technical side of that. And then I also have included here at the bottom, that's my personal email. I know this is kind of a limited amount of time, so I'm happy to, if you guys want to reach out to me with any questions, or if you're working on maybe a draft of an audiovisual story and you kind of want to, you're struggling with it, you want some outside advice, I'm happy to kind of help in any way that I can to answer any questions. So that's my personal email there. And I'll open it up now for the Q&A here, if I can get back to the screen. All right, yeah, opening it up.
All right, hi Isaac, that was a great presentation, but I had a question. In your fourth point, you said that you should make the subject the hero of a story, but my question is it necessary that every story needs to have a hero? And I guess as a follow-up to that question is, in some stories, is presenting the challenge like the main objective? So would those not require a hero for those?
That's a good question. I would argue that I think that every complete story does have a hero. Something, because if you're presenting a challenge, if you're just presenting the challenge, I would argue that that's not necessarily a complete arc. But in some cases, maybe the hero isn't necessarily a specific person or a specific group of people, but maybe just a solution is kind of the hero that you're championing throughout your story. But for it to kind of have like the feeling of a full arc, I generally do think it's important that you set up, here's the challenge to overcome, and here's something that might be able to overcome that challenge, so that the viewer is like rooting for that success story, basically. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, yeah. All
Okay.
right. Thank you.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. And that leads into another question that was coming from some of the folks before of how do you balance like storytelling for a complete product or solution or system that you've already developed and how it fits into the design process. And I was actually, maybe Chad and Alex have some insight into this as well. But in some of the UI UX work that y'all are doing at Shure, you know, there's things like personas, journey maps, components of a story. So how do you guys in your work look to tell a story without necessarily knowing what the sort of end result is on the UI UX side? And then Isaac, for you, I guess I'm like, how often are you presented with sort of video projects where that's sort of the case, and how do you figure out what the story is?
If you guys want to jump in first.
Yeah, I guess just real quickly, I mean, it's called UI and UX for a reason. It's the U part is the critical piece. It's the user, right? And everything we do is about solving problems for a user. So whether we're talking about a product or a release or a feature, you know, you can go really granular, but you're starting with a problem statement. The user wants to accomplish something. They want to do something easier, better, faster. And what we're proposing is that we look into that solution. You don't have to have the solution in place when you're proposing the actual project, but you're saying this is the problem space that we're dealing with, and this is the activities that we think we need to do to uncover what the right solution is. And then as you're going through the process, you can then say, you know, here's what we did, here's what we learned, here's the solutions we came up with, here's the testing we did that proved that the solution is correct, and, you know, bring it all the way home to, and this is what we delivered.
Yeah, I can add on to that, definitely. If you guys remember, like, some of our favorite movies and stories include nuanced villains who think that they're the hero. And I think that's relevant because, like, we, as like user experience or product designers, we want our products to be the solution or be the hero of the story because the users are experiencing these problems. And sometimes we're not. Sometimes we're the villain, and we have to understand that. And we have to ask why, because maybe we don't actually understand the problem, or maybe we're like not fully understanding our users. And I think that's really important to our process as well.
When you guys are working sort of mid-project, how often do you find yourself in a position where you're telling the story of your team to sort of an outside stakeholder? And then when are you bringing in video? When are you bringing in PowerPoint? When are you bringing in, you know, in-person visuals? Alex, I see some, you know, posters behind you. When are you bringing in posters and those different tools to help tell the story?
Yeah, I think that's really important. So as a designer, I have a lot of stakeholders, right? I have my developers, I have product manager, project manager, quality assurance testers. And I think part of the challenge is, like, for people who are like very removed from the users, I need to kind of help them understand who they are. So I try to like use things like personas and journey maps up front with people. I like to write like mini stories when we like come up with a use case scenario, instead of like the user must do this at this time. It's like, oh, Isaac is an audio engineer, and like he is experiencing these problems on a Saturday morning. How can we help him? Like something that makes it more personable. And I think it just helps. When I conduct usability testing, for example, I try to get like recordings and then show people clips or quotes or photos of like maybe people looking confused or people like making mistakes. And it's like, okay, like this is an actual person. We're not making this up. How can we address that? So it doesn't happen as often as I would like, but whenever there's a chance, I try to like bring those artifacts in, and I think it helps.
Yeah, I second that. I know we've had some really powerful use of video clips from research sessions that drive the point home. It's one thing if we say we went out and talked to customers and this is what we heard, It's another thing if you hear the customer say it themselves. Just to Isaac's point earlier, is you stay out of the story. You let the customer tell what their problem is and how we're trying to solve it.
That's some great points there, and I think that leads to Isaac, maybe a question for you. When you're working with these multifaceted teams, you guys brought up like developers, the customer, the end user, the QA folks, your actual sort of like front end design team, back end design team. They're all a part of the story. So as the sort of like videographer, and sometimes maybe you're seen as like the storyteller, but do you own the story? Like, how do you manage that process of figuring out what the story is and tying it together without having to be the owner of the story?
Yeah, that's a fair, good question. Yeah, there's definitely like a lot of, especially like when it's about a product evolution. There are a lot of people who've had hands in it, and there's a lot of creative visions for it by the time it already reaches me. And in terms of like deciding how to form the story, again, the easiest thing for me is to kind of see that instead of trying to like tell it from my version, see what is already there, because it's already got usually the bones of what's important by the time it reaches me. Obviously, like it's been designed for a reason the way that it's been designed. There's a story behind why it's designed that way. If it's, if we have customer reactions to it, they obviously have, stories behind why they like or don't like a certain feature of it. So it's kind of neat to be in my role in that I don't really have to have a lot of like heavy-handedness and like directing things. It's kind of more like chiseling off like the pieces that don't need to be there to kind of show the sculpture that's already like inside of the marble. And the other thing that I'll add is kind of because I talked about like let the story tell itself. You're not necessarily if you're not in the story, don't like try and like force your hand on it. But obviously, in terms of telling the stories of product design, a lot of our designers at Shure are part of the story. And in those cases, we do want to include those voices. But again, even they're talking from a standpoint not of like, we wanted to make like the best product. It's we knew from the industry that this is a pain point that a lot of people have had. This is something that our users can identify with. And we took on that challenge of like, how do we solve this problem for these people? So always kind of putting the focus back, making your end user the hero. It's not, we have a great product because of these features. It's, we have a great product because it allows you to do these incredible things.
Yeah, that's a really solid point. I think that's a version of that expertise that you were talking about, bringing in the designers as people who've experienced sort of across versions of this. Thank you very much for that.
Isaac, I have and apologies if there's some white noise. Isaac, I have a question about how do you decide what platform is best to tell your story? I'm thinking specifically about the sort of storytelling competition Shure and DFA has. Right, we've invited students to sort of tell a story on a PowerPoint or through a blog or through a video. Do you have some tips to like deciding what platform will work best for your story?
Yeah, I can speak a little bit to that. I mean, I think that the biggest point is look at what are the demands of the story. If it's a visual story, I think you really need a visual element in there. And it's kind of a bit of like a personal preference thing, but I personally connect better with hearing individual stories, which I personally connect better with when I can hear that person's voice. So I feel stronger when I'm hearing someone's story. I connect better with them if I'm hearing an audio recording of them or seeing a videotaped interview with them. But definitely play to your strengths. If you're more comfortable in a blog format or a PowerPoint format, or if you don't have like specific people that you're able to reach, or you don't have the resources that you need to necessarily get a video or an audio recording, definitely I think you can play to your strengths and pick the format that you're most comfortable with and feel strongest working in.
Can I throw that
Yeah.
same question to Chad and Alex?
Yeah, I guess if you're going the PowerPoint route, or trying to present in front of slides, and I think this is fairly common advice, but don't throw too much content on the slides. Make the slides your kind of like big power, like an image or a stat or something that's like the crux of what you're going to talk about, and then talk around it. And I can't think of the name of the presentation, but there's presentation styles that you can go and find on YouTube and things like that, that they limit you, like it's 5 seconds a slide, and you just kind of walk through your story, and you make sure that what you're saying isn't what's up behind you, and that you go through the story arc and you end in a certain amount of time. You're not kind of wandering around and losing track. So I know my slides for when I'm presenting it at work, and whether it's presenting new product ideas that I want to do, or how we're building the team and things like that, whether it's more organizational or product centric, I really try to make as minimal amount number of slides and the minimal amount of content on the slide.
I think the format is Pechakucha that you're talking about, right, Chad?
Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah.
that's it.
Yeah. No, I agree. It's a great format. And then
Yeah,
just
I
to
had a
quickly.
question. So like
Oh,
normally,
sorry, Ritvik. There's
Yeah.
some technical issues, and Ritvik can't
Yeah.
hear Alex, so Ritvik doesn't know that Alex
Okay.
is talking right
Oh,
now.
sorry. Yeah.
Apologies for that. Alex, go ahead.
I was just gonna quickly chime into Alan's question about like how to choose what platform or what medium. Yeah, I totally agree with what Isaac and Chad said, and I would just add, like it really depends on like what will resonate with the audience that you're trying to reach, and like if they like work well with slides or video or photos or writing. Some people really do like reading dense text, and some people like just pictures. And like for me, like because I'm a very practical person, part of it is like, can people easily access this, and like how can we share it, and how can we make it readily available? So maybe it does look like a giant poster that we put on the wall or something like that. So I really try to think about what the audience needs.
Thanks, Alex. Yeah, the book Resonate by Nancy Duarte is a really great sort of walkthrough of the story arc, and it talks about both video and presentation, and how you can sort of understand your audience some different ways. And they actually have that book available free online too, if you all want to check that out for your own project storytelling. Ritvik, take it away.
All right. So in like design and otherwise, most stories stick to one platform, like either audio or like visual storytelling. But is there like a scope for a cross-platform storytelling, or is it just more efficient to stick to one platform?
To me, that sounds like an opportunity. I definitely think that, and that's certainly in terms of like social media content, which is something that I deal with a lot. I know it's a slightly different standpoint, but if you can continue a story, it's going to have larger and larger impact the more that it's able to kind of snowball and build on itself. And one of the most effective ways to do that is to have the ability to kind of start it on one platform and have ways to turn other people to other platforms if they want to follow it. Or also just by using multiple platforms, you're automatically, to Alex's point, kind of making it accessible to more people where they already are. So I think that using like a multimedia format to tell a larger story sounds like an opportunity.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Isaac.
Yeah, Isaac, with that, could you maybe tell about the last sort of project where you were doing some of that, and how did you create that snowball with social media?
Yeah, definitely. So, for instance, we're actually the video that I played for you today, the David Byrne video, has not actually been released yet. It'll be released soon, and we kind of build it up, similar to feature films do this, where we'll be releasing like a trailer that kind of whets the appetite for the story on Instagram and Facebook, and then that reaches people already on those platforms and maybe rolls them into watching the full version of the video on YouTube, which links to, we have a landing page that kind of has, that's called Shure Success Stories. It includes this video, and then we have 3 others that are in a similar vein, that kind of tell the stories of 3 other projects using Axient Digital to overcome some of their specific challenges. So kind of opening it up larger and larger. So if your audience wants to, sink their teeth into more of what you're talking about, hopefully you have something there for them to continue to kind of pull the yarn a little further.
Yeah, that's making me think about, for last year's summit, we were working with different high schoolers and high school organizations in the Chicagoland area, but we were actually using Instagram stories sort of the 2 months leading up, where our team, who was making visits to meet with high schoolers in the high schools themselves, or like doing the journey mapping, doing some of that synthesis, and then even sharing it back to the experts, we used Instagram stories to do like little highlights. And that was really great because it forced you into sort of 10-minute chunks. You had to say sentences 10 seconds. You had to say 10-second sentences, but you could tie those together into sort of a 1-minute story. And that was a fun way to bring people into the process and get them excited for the event without having to know exactly what was going on sort of throughout. This is also leading to a question of sort of voice expertise. How do you balance really technical stuff versus not? Like Isaac, you mentioned he said this thing that's like 40 in-ear microphone, 40 channels, 120 hanging things, all of this stuff that for a certain audience, that's like, oh, wow, that's really difficult. I'm thinking about some teams here, even at Northwestern, we had last year, this team was working on a composting project with coffee grounds and mushrooms. And I'm pretty certain they are top 1% of the globe in mushroom knowledge at this point, just from working on that project for a year, because they got really deep into mushrooms. And some of the things that they were proposing required that technical knowledge. But as the storyteller, as the sort of not owner of the story, but the person shaping that story, shaping that marble, how do you balance that with your audience, especially for things like these videos that maybe aren't being released just to a technical audience, but are going to a broader audience as well?
Definitely, yes. And there's a fair amount of kind of working around that at Shure, because there's some things in the product design that go over my head, even with some amount of audiovisual expertise. The first thing is definitely, I think the hook, it always needs to be something that is like broadly comprehensible. So David Byrne saying, like, there were a lot of things that could have gone wrong. This idea with everyone mobile is a simple idea, but it's not easy to accomplish. And so again, the more you can get people in the story being kind of like contextualizing, like if you don't understand this element, like understand that it's very hard to do, or understand like the core element of it. The other big thing that is going to be a dear friend, or has been a dear friend to me, is visualizing with graphics, which obviously requires some more time and a little more work and expertise. But especially when we're talking, like explaining ways that we've changed airflow inside of microphones, if someone's just talking through it, it goes over my head. But if you put a diagram of the microphone and show me where air is moving through it, then it's easier for me, even as kind of a layperson, to wrap my head around that sort of thing.
Yeah, that definitely makes sense. How do you make those graphics? Is that something that you do? Do you look to the design team to do that? Do you have other people who come in to do that?
Yes, the way we handle it is kind of a split. Some of the elements our internal video team will create. Some of the elements our internal design team will create. And occasionally, we have to reach out to external partners to create some things that are above my pay grade.
Gotcha.
But and obviously that is an investment. But I will say, like, the payoff from those sorts of things, especially when it like helps clarify understanding, is way worth it in my experience.
Alex and Chad, what are some of the tools that you're using to share the story mid-process?
Alex, you want to take this one? I know from a technical standpoint, we jump around on different tools. We'll just, whatever it takes to get the job done right. But I think there's some interesting stuff in around prototyping that Alex has been working with some of the other people on our team to explain how some of our microphones work.
Yeah, I'm working on interesting projects where, like, communicating to people about like what's going on with the microphone is like one of the goals, right? And I've literally made maybe like 30 different wireframe prototypes for this one microphone. And part of it is like you don't know what the right solution is until like you see it, and then even when you see it, it's like, what's going on here, right? And I think something important for people to understand is like there's nothing wrong with it being a total failure and like and fucking it up, and that's probably the most exciting part. So I like work with like different people who can like code JavaScript prototypes, and I also make my own wireframe prototypes. And then I just sort of like tell people like, okay, like try to envision this is the final product. How do you feel about it? Do you think this is the right solution? Like, do you think that this is doing what we want? And the more that we can try to frame that for people, the more and like for them to envision the final solution, I guess like just the more effective you are as a communicator, because if you're just sort of waving your hands around and talking a lot versus just like just draw something on the whiteboard, and it might be a shitty drawing, but if it communicates a story to someone, then it does the job.
Yeah,
I don't know if that answered your question.
No, that it was. And then even getting nitty-gritty, so you mentioned a whiteboard or just drawing something. What are the programs that you're using the most on a weekly basis? PowerPoint, Adobe, Premiere, Pencil?
Yes, Adobe, Sketch, Axure. I actually really like Axure, but for some reason, like other people on my team don't.
What is Axure?
It's just like a wireframing tool. It's like I feel like Sketch is more popular, and Sketch is really great for like, oh, I just want to like quickly get all these like wireframes out. But Axure helps you create really complex interactions. So that's why I like it. Except sometimes like people think that it's real software, and then they're like, "Why isn't this button working?" And I'm like, "Because it's not a button. It's it's a circle." Yeah, some Illustrator. I use Illustrator all the time. Sometimes PowerPoint, but that's more for like trying to, like sometimes people don't want to implement my designs, and then I have to convince them. So then that's when I break out my PowerPoint. Okay. Yeah, those are my favorite tools.
Chad, how about you from your perspective? Because you're telling the story of your team, and it's a little different sometimes.
Yeah, I end up having to use more of the corporate tools because I'm delivering to corporate people. So I spend a little bit too much time in PowerPoint. But it's whatever it takes. Like Alex said earlier, if you need to send out the story, you need people to view it. You have to give it to them in a format that they can understand and they're comfortable reading. And so, yeah, unfortunately, a little bit more presentation and a lot more talking and maybe less designing and doing. But it's we've also gone, in the more technical route. We have some of our work partners are the engineers in the system engineering and things like that. And so we're looking at tools like Abstract to do version control for our deliverables because they have version control for theirs, and they want to marry those two things up. So, we're continuing to expand and always looking at new solutions.
Yeah. And for folks who don't necessarily have Adobe backgrounds or things like that, PowerPoint, Keynote, they've actually been getting better in the last few years at some of their visual design tools, some of the alignment things that you can do in there. I think if you know some of those sort of core basic principles, sometimes, you can get something up in PowerPoint just as quickly as you could in Adobe. And it is a little easier to share. So that's where knowing your audience. Are you working with a design team? Are you trying to co-design? If you're trying to co-design, it might not be the best time to be asking everybody to get Photoshop and Illustrator open because everyone's going to stare at you. Isaac, how about you? What are you in most?
So I mostly live in the Adobe Creative Suite. So Premiere Pro for video editing, After Effects for a lot of my graphics, some 3D programs, Cinema 4D for like making 3D models of things, and a little bit of Illustrator and Photoshop. But I mostly stick to the sphere of the Creative Cloud.
Awesome. Thank you. Isaac, I'm wondering if I could put you on the spot a little bit. And you talked about how you made a format and then broke it through that video. I was wondering if you'd be comfortable giving us almost like the director's commentary of that video, and maybe like walking through some of those key moments or something. Like, would you mind pulling up that video again, and then we could sort of walk through? Awesome. While you're doing that, how about and getting the screen ready, I'm just going to give everyone the overview of the Shure competition here. So as mentioned at the top of the broadcast, Shure is sponsoring Design for America storytelling competition. This is a competition open to all DFA design teams, and it will actually you'll be entered when you register your project. So we're collecting all of the stories. We're really excited to look at those. And then what we're going to do is we're going to look at, how is the challenge being portrayed? How is the story of the key stakeholders being portrayed? What are some of the different ways that you're doing it, whether it's a visual diagram explaining the challenge or the solution, or a blog or different things like that? Can the audience understand why this is something worth having a project for, and then what your project is? So our team's going to select some semi-finalists, and we're actually going to hand it over to Shure. And we've got a really great panel of folks on Shure's side, from Alex to a senior exec. And then we're going to, they're going to select 2 winners for the sort of best story overall and the best audio visual story, multimedia story. That if you win the best story overall, you are still eligible to win the best multimedia story, but you don't have to have a multimedia story to enter the competition. We're really looking for those sort of key pieces of storytelling that Isaac mentioned, which are applicable across platforms and domains. So you don't need to be a video expert. You don't need to be the best drawer. Tell the story in the way that your team is able to tell the story. Submissions are going to open mid-April, and then they're going to close in late May. That way we can get both the quarter schools and the semester schools involved, and we're really looking forward to all of that. So make sure your teams know that they'll be entering this competition when they submit their project registration. If they want to opt out, they can, but we think it's a really great opportunity, and you're always submitting that anyway, so no loss there. And then we'll be announcing those winners this summer, and then we'll actually use the summit to talk about all of the really great stories we collected throughout. So when you come to the DFA summit, you'll get to see all of the stories from across the DFA network, because DFA is turning 10 this year, and we're here to share the story of everyone who's been a part of this really, really fantastic movement across the country. So thank you for the support for Shure for that. And Isaac, are you ready to go? Awesome.
Yeah. So I wish I had the project on my laptop too, because then I could kind of walk you through the project. But to give you kind of a sense of the way that I start breaking it up, is I go through each long form interview and cut each quote that sounds like it fits into the overall story that I'm trying to tell. And then I'll organize those inside of Premiere, kind of clip next to each other that are around the same topics. And then I'll add markers above them and kind of label them as those subpoints that I was mentioning earlier. And so that kind of gives me the format to figure out, well, where do these subpoints fit in with each other? And then also, like, where can I find like a strong opening and a strong end? So I'll just kind of briefly go through some of those points in action in the video here.
There was a lot of
Oh,
things.
could you do you mind sharing your screen?
Oh yeah, sorry. Of course. Entire screen. There we go. Let's bring that back to the front.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, no worries. So here you can kind of see I'm moving from the outside in visually.
Completely empty stage and Taravan mobile is a really simple idea, but technically not so easy to realize.
So yeah, the hook in there kind of that's the attention grabber, is the concept that David Byrne has for the show, and him saying, yeah, this was not going to be easy for us to do. That immediately brings in your attention, because, you know, we like to see people overcome challenges.
The journey began last summer with finding gear that could actually do 48 channels of wireless with a load of in-ears. And oh, by the way, once you've got all these RF channels, we're going to hang 125 feet of chain around the stage.
So that quote there kind of does two things. It's setting up the like inferred reliability. He's talking about, we were looking for this gear that could do these things that are very difficult to do. And then that's kind of implied later on once we bring in, we're talking about Axiom Digital, that these are features that the audio audience that I'm speaking to, knowing my audience, these are the things that they're going to care about knowing. And also it kind of helps build on elevating those stakes. He's establishing, again, we didn't even know if there was gear that could do these things, and without these things, this show would not have been possible. And again, like I kind of mentioned earlier, initially I had this as later on in the video, kind of underpinning the idea that there was reliability, and it was kind of under that sub point. But later on in the edit, I decided to move it closer up to the front because it really helped build it from the tension of David Byrne's first comment, and kind of establish the stakes really solidly in the beginning of the video.
Unfortunately, as Shure said, we've got something coming out next month that you should probably take a look at. Axiom Digital is amazing. This tour wouldn't exist without it.
So now I've kind of established the difficulty of the challenge that is in front of them, is now when I bring in the solution, and that's kind of the thesis is, this product is phenomenal and it allowed us to do this show. And then basically everything beyond this is just kind of underpinning that with specific examples under subpoints. So he kind of talks for a little bit here about the audio quality. And speaking in terms of like the examples that underpin that, I never want to have it just someone saying like, oh, the sound quality is impeccable. That may be a great way to start the sub point, but I would never count that as like an underpinning example. They need to be specific things that kind of prove that. Like he's talking about like all the high frequency stuff sounded as good as it does on a wired system, or the David Byrne's comment a little later here where he talks about people thought that we were using recordings. That reinforces the idea of it sounds really good without having someone just saying like, oh, it sounds really good. You need to kind of prove your points. So I think that's kind of the first sub point that I go through.
We're saying this sounds too good for you guys to be actually playing this. You've got tracks, you got playback happening, right? And so now we do a thing where we start the song instrument by instrument, and people hear how the whole thing fits together. I know for a fact things have been dropped, things have hit the floor pretty hard, and we haven't, nothing's broken. I don't think that we've necessarily put it to the use.
So there, I'm bringing in the second subpoint, kind of talking about durability and how tough and well built these things are. And then with this next comment, which is also about durability, but I found it to be a pretty good transition point. This next comment into the comment right after it, because he's talking about how they're using it, the gear in an unconventional way, and it still stands up in terms of durability. And then the comment that follows that from John Chadwick, it kind of builds off that, saying that we're using this gear in a very unconventional way, but it's still reliable even among the chain.
For which it was entirely intended.
Worked as a good transition point between each other.
Microphones and transmitters on drums that are being beat on pretty severely for 2 hours.
Just the fact that they can move around and not worry about dropouts, interference. They pass through the chain. They even do a song encased in the chain. There's no issues. Anything that we throw at Axiom Digital, it just seems to work.
So yeah, he's talking about the unconventional way that they're using this gear for the show, but it still holds up in terms of reliability. And then he kind of caps it off with the kind of that bringing home point of anything we throw at Axiom Digital, it just seems to work, which is almost an echo of kind of where I came in with my thesis, which is Axiom Digital is amazing. This show wouldn't exist without it. So kind of using those two as bookends on the subpoints allows it to have like kind of a natural flow from intro into like proof of what I'm talking about, and then come back out to an outro. And the outro comment is this last little comment from David Byrne here.
But it's hard to imagine going back to a kind of more conventional setup now, certainly for me, but I think for others who have seen this show, they're also thinking, whoa, he's moved the goalposts.
So you can see how that final comment from him kind of echoes his initial comment, where he sets up the video talking about how this is a really unconventional idea, and I didn't know if it was possible. And then the story of proving it's possible because of Axiom Digital. And then at the very end, we come back and he's reinforcing that idea that it was an unconventional show. And he opens up to the future by saying, I'm not sure what I'm going to do next. And maybe other people have been inspired by this too.
Awesome. Thank you for that little masterclass there, Isaac. That was fun to get into your process a little bit and see how that overall story was told. Thank you to Shure for all of your support in this competition and this webinar. And we're looking forward to continuing this really fantastic relationship and helping DFA teams tell their stories of their communities and the folks that they get the chance to work with across the network and to the country. So thank you everybody for joining. Thank you for those who stayed on the view for the masterclass here at the end. This webinar will be recorded and is you can start watching it right now on YouTube. So make sure you like our YouTube channel, and we will see you all next time. Have a great rest of your day, y'all.
Thanks so much, everyone. Bye.